Hi there. Good afternoon. Something that I have taught about and thought about goes back really to my years as a military history graduate student at American Military University and the American Public University system. And this is the idea of a decisive military victory that isn't truly decisive until it's been ratified by another. The cases that come to my mind right away are in World War II. We accept Midway as a decisive victory for the United States Navy, where the core of the Japanese carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, four carriers were sunk at Midway just with the loss of the USS Yorktown, and that this enabled the United States to really take the offensive against Japan and in time allow the greater American industrial productivity to replace sunk carriers, and while Japan could not, and take the victory right to Tokyo Bay. In a way, I see this as sort of misleading. That this is not to detract from the importance of Midway, but I don't think it was truly decisive until it was ratified by the American victories at Guadalcanal. That there, the United States took the offensive against Japan, inflicted greater losses still on their fleets in both surface combat and carrier operations while continuing to lose aircraft carriers of its own. The Wasp, the Hornet, the Enterprise was severely damaged. Um, there was the major naval defeat at Salvo Island by a cruiser force that was basically annihilated by the Japanese. And of course, there was the attrition in aircraft and ground forces on Guadalcanal. It was in this way a harder won victory than Midway. But this is what ratified the victory at over the Kido Butai in June of 1942. That it took this months long trifibious, if you will, combined operation in Guadalcanal to set up the eventual American offensives across the South Pacific and the Central Pacific. Without that victory at Guadalcanal, Midway would have been far less important. Secondly, there's Stalingrad. Sixth Army goes to Stalingrad, doesn't come back. Soviet offensive crushes the flanks, forces the hurried retreat of the Germans from the Caucasus, and they keep right on going until they recapture Kharkov and then are thrown out by a brilliant counterattack orchestrated by Erich von Manstein. This is the narrative that we accept. I'm not sure it was completely decisive until it was ratified by the Soviet victory the next summer at Kursk. Another failed German offensive goes right into the teeth of the Soviet defense, gets ground down and finally defeated. That this is what made Stalingrad really decisive. It was Kursk. One could even see it with Normandy. Operation Overlord was an incredible victory by the Western powers that resulted in the destruction of the German Army Group B in the Falaise pocket and then a headlong pursuit across France to the borders of Germany, liberating Belgium along the way. And what really held back the Allies wasn't German resistance when they got to the border, it was lack of supplies. That they had insufficient fuel stockpiles to go much further. And this exacerbated, too, the big issue with Montgomery and Patton, who was going to get the fuel. And then you have Montgomery's insistent harping about a narrow front offensive, which of course would have been commanded by him, to the detriment of Patton. Now, this is not to detract again from the victory at Normandy, but I see Normandy as well as setting the table for the Soviets' own victory. The destruction of Army Group Center in the Soviet Union in the offensive to the Vistula, right through Belarus. What the Soviets called Operation Bagration, named after the famous and famously ugly Georgian general who fought Napoleon and was eventually, well, he also had a torrid love affair with the Tsar's sister. So he could, ugly though he may have been, it didn't exactly hold him back there. But Bagration ratified Normandy. You have the major victories in Normandy on the beaches going through Saint-Lô and then Falaise. And it set the table in a lot of ways for the Soviets. We can look at this too as a really good case of combined and joint operations between allies. That the United States and Britain had a far better ability to coordinate with the Soviets than, say, the Germans ever did with the Japanese. They were on the same side but fighting two separate wars. There was much more cooperation, coordination between the Western Allies and the Soviets. And while not decisive in and of itself, this was a major reason for the eventual Allied victory in Europe. And the exploitation of Normandy, the coordination with Bagration, is evidence of that. So, I see World War II as a really good case of this. I also see cases in which a decisive victory was not fully ratified, and therefore it wasn't as decisive as maybe it could have been. And this comes from our Civil War. I see Robert E. Lee as one of the most offensive-minded generals, along with his running mate Stonewall Jackson. But Lee wasn't so much offensive as he was a counterpuncher. This is my personal view. For example, he did drive the Army of the Potomac out of the peninsula when they were at the gates of Richmond. He took over for Joe Johnston after he was wounded at Seven Pines and immediately took the offensive against George Britton McClellan, 100,000 men of the Army of the Potomac, and of course McClellan's own fears and misconceptions. Man who was always willing to take counsel of his fears. Lee drove him out, saved Richmond. It was a defensive battle fought offensively to protect the Confederate capital. Major victory. He immediately turns around and attacks the Army of Virginia under General John Pope and defeats that at the Battle of Bull Run. Meanwhile, units of the Army of the Potomac are being ferried north by the Union Navy, fed into the campaign in Northern Virginia, and are present for the defeat at Second Bull Run. One of Lee's most impressive victories. My view, a masterpiece. But he doesn't stop there. He counterpunches again and invades Maryland. This first invasion of the North culminates at South Mountain, then at Antietam, which was a decisive victory in all the wrong ways as far as Lee's concerned. McClellan, for once, is able to win a battle. A lot of people call it a tactical deadlock. Maybe it is. However, this was definitely not the decisive victory that Lee wanted. Rather, it's a Union scrape by deadlock victory, a tactical victory to use a common wargaming term. But much bigger than that in some ways. Politically, it was close enough to a major victory to allow Abraham Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which politically was decisive. This prevented France and Britain, especially Britain, from intervening or trying to mediate on the Confederate side because of the empowerment of the British electorate, who were far more abolitionist than even the most dedicated people in the North, that it turned what had been a war for the Union into a war for liberty. So, yeah, that backfired on the Confederates. Also, too, had the battle gone to a second day on September 18th, 1862, there's no doubt in my mind that Lee would have been crushed. As combative as he was, he made a very bad decision to hang around Sharpsburg, Maryland. And the only thing that really saved him was McClellan's habitual timidity and his inability to seize the moment. Yeah, he seized the moment by trying to counter Lee once he discovered, or a Union cavalryman discovered, Lee's general orders at a former campsite near Frederick, Maryland, later part of the Monocacy battlefield. But this prevented Lee from achieving the victory that he needed at Antietam. A second day, he would have been crushed. As it was, he was lucky to get back across the Potomac and into safety. And McClellan, of course, lost his job because of this. Lincoln finally ran out of patience with McClellan and his inability to pursue the Confederates. So there was the decisive victory that never happened for Lee. And you could say, too, that McClellan passed up two chances to win the Civil War. Once in the Peninsula, the second one at Antietam. Two golden chances to win the war, and he blew them both. So that's a case of a decisive victory, two decisive victories that didn't pan out for Robert E. Lee. The next year we see something very similar. He defeats Fighting Joe Hooker at Chancellorsville, a battle he had no business winning. Hooker got the jump on him, and then again he got timid. He stopped and gave Lee the chance to counterattack. Lee wins another decisive victory over a lesser general with more troops, and Hooker retreats, whining and complaining as he was wont to do. And Lee, after a period of reorganization, in large part because Stonewall Jackson was killed in a friendly fire incident at the end of the first day, he reorganizes his two-corps army into three corps without his right arm in Thomas Jonathan Jackson, and he counterpunches by invading the North. Again, this time he is more crushingly defeated at Gettysburg. Not by Hooker, he has been relieved, and after a very short period in command of the Army at the Potomac, George Gordon Meade carries the day. Now, these are cases in which the decisive victory was not followed up by a second one in order to ratify the decision of the first. The three episodes I talked about in World War II were clearly cases of this working. The two in the American Civil War were cases where the Confederacy failed to get that second victory to underline, emphasize the whole point of the first one. Maybe it happened, the one time I would say that it did was with the fall of Atlanta. William Tecumseh Sherman takes Atlanta, major economic and military defeat for the Confederacy. John Bell Hood takes the army, and instead of resisting um, whatever Sherman was going to do next, he goes gallivanting into Tennessee, where he's eventually crushed uh, by George Thomas at the Battle of Nashville. But the real follow up here was not a military victory so much as an economic and political one when Sherman marched across Georgia. As I remember a British historian saying, he was a little loose with matches, but he had this eminently destructive campaign across Georgia to Savannah. Now, some Confederates at the time said that he was in full retreat, that he was running scared across Georgia to get to Savannah and the protection of the United States Navy. Yeah, fat chance. This was one of the war's most effective exploitations of a victory. It did enormous economic damage. It affected the morale of the South. Sherman endeavored to make Georgia howl, as it were, till he got to Savannah. So there goes one of the main industrial and transportation centers of the Confederacy, followed by massive destruction to the agricultural and economic sectors across the state down to the major port. Yeah, I wouldn't call that a retreat. This was the emphasis, the underline, the capitalization of the original victory at Atlanta. Followed again by the march across South Carolina, which neutralized Charleston. And again, you have a difficult case here of achieving victory because of logistical problems going in late in the year into a less productive part of South Carolina than Sherman had encountered in Georgia. And this ends basically in North Carolina. He stops burning things when he gets to Raleigh because he sees the end of the war. When he gets to Raleigh, the war is basically won, irrespective of the Confederate attack at Bentonville near Glassboro, North Carolina. Probably most notable because it was done by Joe Johnston, who had about as much aggressive spirit as George Britton McClellan. Always found an excuse to retreat. This was him going on the offensive. It's kind of like seeing a bunny rabbit go after, you've seen my dog Dudley earlier in the video, bunny rabbit going after Dudley. Totally out of character. But in this instance, the war is basically won on the basis of decisive victories on top of other decisive victories, one ratifying the other. The first setting the stage for the second ratifying the decision of the first. In Sherman's case, the first decisive victory was Atlanta. The others were the marches through Georgia and South Carolina. More difficult, maybe more destructive to the Confederacy, but it was piling on the momentum. So my view is that a lot of times you can have a decisive victory, but it doesn't really matter as much as it should until it's followed up by another. And this is just my professional view. Your mileage may differ. And I welcome comments. And of course, I welcome people sharing, liking, and subscribing to the channel. But I'll be back and with more on military history, more on wargaming, more on political science, more on research and critical thinking. But I just leave you with some thoughts and hope that you can think for yourselves, come to your conclusions. I know that thinking is hard, as Beavis and Butthead would say. It's hard, and it's dangerous for some of us. So until then, thank you for your time. Thank you for watching. And Dudley in the background, he says the same thing. So until next time.